It is a pleasure to have an author on board who may have written the the piece that synthesizes everything going on in America, sort of how we got here to this place in America. She's an award-winning journalist, and you'll see in our conversation the super well-researched aspects to this book, her latest. She has shed light on the rising influence of religious nationalism in American society. She's done critically acclaimed books prior to this, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. She did the Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. And these begin and continue conversations around these themes. And her latest book brings a lot of these themes together. It's called Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. How about it for Katherine Stewart? Katherine Stewart, welcome, welcome. Wow, there is so much here. You organize this book really well, and you tell these stories really well, and there's a first-person aspect to this book as well. I wonder if we can get into the ways in which you sort of broken things up, the money, lies, and the God. We'll start with something, if it's okay with you, that I think people are aware of, but the interests that go into each one of these things, the money, the lies, and the God, and this was a surprise to me. I mean, I kind of maybe think I was aware of the sort of disparate nature of a lot of these interests that come together, but how they sort of compete even within these overall efforts was an interesting thing. But in any case, let's start with the disinformation, because I think we all are kind of loosely aware of what that is, but you give it a sort of clarity that I've never seen before. Speak to the disinformation campaign, and maybe, if you have to, you can weave these other things too as well. Obviously, they all come together. That's what your book is all about.
That's right. And thanks for the question. So they all do come together. I titled my book Money, Lies, and God because, first, money's a huge part of the story, meaning that huge concentrations of wealth at the top of the economic ladder, the tippy top, really have destabilized the political system in interesting ways. Lies or conscious disinformation is another really huge feature of this movement. A lot of the funders of this movement are actually funding disinformation operations. And number three, God, because the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is Christian nationalism. And they work together, really. So, I pay a huge amount of attention to the funders. Some of them are motivated by, just simply protecting their privileges, and they're typically informed by some kind of libertarian ideology. We have another set of wealthy people driven by more overtly religious and cultural goals. We have power players who run these organizations by making serious um, uh, moves toward a more authoritarian kinds of governance that, these ideas please the funders. They promote deregulatory policies and tax privileges for those at the tippy top, but they also know that they need to sort of mobilize the rank and file. How are you going to get the ordinary people on board with an agenda that's actually impoverishing them and making their lives more difficult? Well, you do that with lies. You do that with disinformation. You do it by emphasizing culture wars, including issues that have little to no relevance in their everyday lives. They just, become a huge distraction.
And by the way, this is interesting to me. Sorry to interrupt, but I was just going to say that you point out specific disinformation, culture war type messaging that is consciously used, is the point, to obscure the actual motives of the forces behind it.
Absolutely. When you go to some of these events, I'm an investigative reporter. I've always felt like we really don't know what's going on unless we're in the room and we can hear it from like the horse's mouth, right? So I go to a lot of right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings. And when you go to those spaces, it's all culture wars all the time. Often, for a long time, it was like abortion is the greatest moral issue of our time. It's the most, same-sex marriage. We got to talk about transgender bathrooms, whatever, like these kinds of issues, some of which, of course, have much more relevance to people's lives than others. But movement leaders know if you can get people to vote on a single issue or 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. So they often distract people with issues related to sexuality and sex because it distracts everybody. And some of those issues make some people feel really uncomfortable. And so when you get them preoccupied with those issues, they're not looking at the economic policies that the funders want. And a lot, the term, the religious nationalism piece of it is also of critical importance, of course, because you've got this large mass of voters who need to be mobilized to support this, or frankly, authoritarian agenda. And the way you do that is through religious nationalism and the culture wars.
Well, the surprise to me through the religious nationalism part of your book was that and again, it's maybe something I was loosely aware of, but that these are all, again, such different faiths often that come together in this effort. I mean, in other words, the derailing of democracy in the service of God or some God-related goal may relate to a bunch of different gods that people have.
This is absolutely true. People often associate religious nationalism in America with white evangelicalism, but the movement draws on a number of different religious identities. By the way, the funders, religiously, they're all over the place. Some are evangelical, some are Catholic, ultra-conservative Catholic, some are Jewish, some are Protestant, some are really very atheistic, but they all agree on the need to sort of destroy what they call the administrative state and crush liberalism, because they know that that's going to serve their broader economic agenda. But the religious nationalism piece of it is really central, because for the rank and file, it's the way that they can legitimize their support for amoral and authoritarian leaders in pursuit of a radically anti-American project, even though they, wave American flags and dress up in red, white, and blue. The idea that of destroying the institutions that sustain democracy and crushing democratic principles of equality and justice and rule of law. I mean, this is a radically anti-American project. So this movement has really set itself very clearly against the Constitution and America's democratic ideals. But the leaders of the movement need to square this with people who've been brought up to be patriotic, and promoting sort of Christian nationalist ideology helps them to that end.
It's interesting. It's almost like what that flag means to one person, it means something else to someone else. And then, to your point, sort of the ends justify the means. We're here to change this country. And to sort of rescue the soul of this country. But let me just double back, because in your book you actually detail, of course, it is so well sourced, and you do go to the. I want to get back to that. You go to these conferences and rallies and all this stuff, and I want to get to some of those in a second. But it's interesting to me as you talk about these different forces that one of the greatest funders of Leonard Leo's project, and I've talked about Leonard Leo on this show for years. I mean, I see him as one of the he's really gotten the America he wants. It's a remarkable thing that he's done, but he's been supercharged by this donor that you mentioned in your book.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can just go through that, because that's an extraordinary way that that his movement was just vaulted into relevance in a way, and dominance in a way it hadn't been prior.
That's right. Leonard Leo, as you've explained on multiple occasions, sort of as a money man for the religious right, and particularly the sort of far right legal ecosphere. He's really built up certainly the Supreme Court to where it is today, and the Federalist Society to where it is today. So he's also, sort of financed raised and spent financing for a range of related organizations in that sphere. But he recently got a huge boost by a fellow named Barry Seid, a Jewish Chicago billionaire who his motivations do not appear to be religious at all. And he, 1.6 billion with a B, to create an organization called the Marble Freedom Trust. It's they can spend $230 million per year without touching the nut. And he put Leonard Leo in charge of it. So it really shows that on the funder level, it's, I think Leonard Leo to be honest, really does have a particular religious and cultural agenda. But two things can be true at the same time. He can have this agenda and realize that, like, his, what he wants will never pass at the ballot box. So if you can take the courts, you can take over the country, right? So he can have that cultural and religious agenda, but he can also know that it is very, very good for his own lifestyle. Apparently, he's known for wearing fancy suits and enjoying fancy dinners with fine wines, and has some really lovely homes and things like that. So,
So,
two
so,
things can be true at once.
so religion, and has been really, really good to him. But I mean, that's not unusual. But as you say, and also, he's fetting a lot of other big donors, and he's constantly sort of working that circuit. And so that luxury meets other luxury, I suppose. You call them the funders in your book. Um, this is really, I was trying to figure out, and maybe you can answer it, although people maybe can draw their own conclusion. I was trying to weight the various influences in terms of, percentages. I don't know if you can do that or if you'd even want to, but boy, you do need money in America to make things happen, and the funders are really a big part of this.
That's true. I mean, a lot of people, to be honest, are going to be really hurt as they're destroying the public administration subject to ethics rules, and replace it with, who knows, Elon Musk's privately controlled corporate managed state, staffed by, I would say, incompetence.
So
This
far,
is,
that would seems to be the case. Yeah.
I know this is something that honestly authoritarians do. They will purge the government, the civil service, of anyone they view as sufficiently disloyal, insufficiently loyal, and replace it with someone whose primary qualification is loyalty. And in this way, you're just not getting the best people. I mean, it's really sad. This is also where the lies fits in. I think there's been a tremendous propaganda campaign against government within the Republican Party. And so as a consequence, who is it who said, I want to shrink the government so small it can be drowned in a bathtub? I
Yeah.
think it was Grover
Right.
Norquist. So when Americans are surveyed about the levels of waste and fraud in government, they always come back with ludicrously exaggerated estimates. But now that's not to say that waste and fraud in government agencies doesn't happen. It does. There's room for improvement always, just as there is in the private sector. But people need to be reminded of the very good things that a functioning government can achieve, and the very bad things that happen when you have a lack of functioning government, or in countries where you've got these kleptocratic and cronyistic government arrangements, or sort of inefficient or completely ineffective government.
It's interesting because one of the things that has weaponized or helped weaponize those things that they're weaponizing, this crew, this coalition, if you will, is the disparity, the gulf in economic terms of American life. There is the growing gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And so you have this roiling grievance, it would seem, maybe among the have-nots. And that meets, again, a lot of these interests that are associated with just getting tax cuts and just wanting a change that is self-serving that way. Um, but this is an important part of success for them. I mean, for this coalition of those who put together the money, the lies, and the God, as you say it in your book.
Yes, I mean, I think the biggest, look, there are a lot of different fissures in this movement. Like, for instance, the tech bros, a sector of tech bros who are now, all on board with this stuff. Do you think they're motivated by the religious nationalism piece of it? Of course not. They just think of that as the price of doing business. They just see that as, okay, we got to placate those folks to get the tax and privileged contracts that we want. But I think the biggest disconnect has always really been the disconnect between the funders who want, who are very, very, I think, insecure and defensive. I think they have a sense that their huge wealth that they have is actually coming at the expense of a lot of the rank and file, because it is. And they're deathly afraid that, that the rank and file are going to come after, the people are going to come after them one day with proverbial pitchforks in order to sort of, say, hey, you should be paying your share of taxes. Why are you paying less taxes than a public school teacher? Things like that. So they build these sort of walls around them and justify. But on the rank and file, like when you peel away the culture war stuff, the Christian nationalism, all of that, in general, they really want a better deal for themselves and for the workforce. These folks, I would say, the rank and file of the MAGA movement, I would say, some of them have education, some of them are on the, less educated side of things, but I wouldn't say it's the poor. I would say more it's like the middle to working classes that really support this. Their standard of living has gone down over the last 50 years for sure as a consequence of this sort of right-wing economic ideology that has made things better for those at the top. It's funny, this movement is always saying, well, we're nostalgic. We want to bring things back to the good old days of the 1950s. Well, look at the tax rate, the top tax rate for people in the 1950s. It was a lot higher than it is today. And the average CEO could actually, make 20 something times their average worker, and they could have a really nice house and a second home and a country club and a boat, whatever they wanted, nice lifestyle. Today, the average CEO of a Fortune 500 company makes in the many hundreds of times what their average worker makes. And of course, if you look at the work that's been shipped overseas, it's like even much more. So we're just living in an era of enormous wealth inequality. And rather than think, gosh, maybe we should do something to help form a more perfect union, these guys are really kind of being controlled in a way by their vanity and their insecurities, and they want policies that justify these enormous concentrations of
Well,
wealth.
yeah, I mean, there and you just describe it, the threat and the greed, and it all comes together, and then the blame, because what you're describing is this loss and corrosion of a middle class lifestyle,
Exactly.
and who's to blame for that? And if you can blame the government and the opposition successfully, which has been done, then you can achieve power. And so that's what I mean when I say they've weaponized this in a sense also.
Absolutely. Or if you can blame DEI,
Sure.
which
Right.
is whatever they think it is. It's really clear when they talk, they always cast this now in the language of merit. And are there some diversity programs that did there need to be, was there an overcorrection for some of the past injustices? Yeah, of course. In some places there might have been, but that's not how they're doing it. They're not running this sort of DEI excuse to dismantle the government because they want to actually improve things. They actually, like, when you really dig into the ideology of a lot of these folks, and I do in Money Lies in God, a lot of it is really kind of nutty, sort of super pseudo libertarian. And when they talk about, they say it's merit, but it transparently is like preparation for a total war on anti-discrimination law. It's a way of putting disadvantaged communities back in their place, and it's going to serve as affirmative action for loyalist conservative white men.
Right.
It's something that's intended to make people hesitate, frankly, to hire anyone who's not from that group, because then they could be accused of making a DEI hire,
Yeah,
even if
it's a wild reversal that and you're so clever to point that out, that they can actually have legal exposure by doing this thing that is actually quite innocent.
Yeah,
It, it,
I'm
you
sorry.
you mentioned, just because I wanted to, it's a part of what's always been it's always been an irritant to me, the way people uh, reflexively grab the label libertarian, like it's some, libertarian. Yeah, cool, man. You do what you want. I do what I want. I'm a libertarian. That's of course not what libertarianism is. And you talk about in your book the fact that they call themselves libertarians. This religious movement is oftentimes claimed as a libertarian movement. Can you just spend a second on that?
Absolutely. Well, you look at somebody like Elon Musk, who probably describes himself as a libertarian. He says, let the markets be free and we can all have our freedoms. He also, I mean, look how much he gets in government subsidies. He gets these privileged contracts. These folks want protective policies for their monopolistic businesses. So it's not really like just let the markets be free stuff. And oh, by the way, when you start bringing up personal liberties, like the liberty to say, like receive best practices medical care when you're in a hospital having a miscarriage, forget about it. or the liberty to decide if and when you want to become a parent, forget about it. The religious leaders, sort of sergeants and the power players who are, I would say more even the sergeants who are sort of running the show, they are hell-bent on restricting the liberties of the groups in society that they think should be subordinate.
Yeah, and by the way, sergeants an actual kind of you talk about sergeants in your book. I mean, that's you have the breakdown, and it serves the reader well as you go on this journey. Now, I do want to get into your journey a little bit because it's really and one of the things I liked was there's sort of a first person aspect to your book, and you went to all of these different rallies and these different coalitions of religious groups and mega churches, et cetera. I mean, this is clearly something you've been researching this book for how long? Clearly a long time.
I've been in this field for 16 years, and
Right, right.
Money Lies in God is my third book. I sort of fallen down the rabbit hole. But, I recognized right from the start, once I started researching the right-wing legal movement, and I saw how they were recasting this whole idea of freedom of religion as something rather than, pertaining to the religion clauses of the First Amendment, sort of aligning it with a free speech clause of the First Amendment, without getting into the technical weeds here, I could see that they were going to turn civil rights law on its head
Mm.
and say, if you're religious, you have a right to exempt yourself from all of the laws and rules in society that you don't like, but that have to pertain to everyone else. So, yeah, and I've always thought, listen, I was trained as an investigative reporter by a fellow named Wayne Barrett, who wrote the first biography of Donald Trump, which he was researching and writing when I was training with him. So I've known about that guy for years.
Yeah, so you
Various
go
real.
inside the movement. Really, you're in the belly of the beast. There's one kind of a traveling roadshow of religion and conspiracy. I'd love
Oh,
for you to relate a little bit of that.
yeah, I mean, do you know what Reawaken America is? So anybody listening who doesn't know, look it up. It's a feast. It's a certain kind of a feast. It's a traveling pro-MAGA conspiracy fest. They've set up in dozens of churches around the country. They've been doing this for since the sort of COVID crisis began. And what they do is they draw thousands of people, you know, people who are sort of members of the rank and file. And there's these, every single conspiracy you can possibly imagine is in these spaces. You walk in there and you're hearing about the great replacement. You're hearing about how, 666 is emblazoned on the World Health Organization's doors, and they're trying to microchip you, and they want to kill us off and replace us with aliens. And JFK is still alive. It's a conspiracy, and the 2020 election was stolen, and Donald Trump is, this great savior of our nation. He's a representative of, he's a white hat fighting, like every single crazy conspiracy. One of the Trump kids usually shows up to speak. I mean, this really shows that it's not something that's really outside the purview of Trump. It's very much a part of the Trump world. And so thousands of people attend to each one. And I got to tell you, Mark, they're not all bad people. They're not. I mean, some of them are, I chat with people, and some of them are really relatable. They love their families, they care about their communities, they really think they're doing what's best for America. But they've been subject to this barrage of lies that's confused them. And I think all those lies are intended to disorient people.
Right.
You're hearing this lie and this lie and this lie, and none of them they're not all consistent. So you're just confused. You just get spun around. And then you're more primed to think, well, Donald Trump has never done anything wrong, and all the charges against him are just a deep state conspiracy. And, public schools are just places, they're just gender change factories, like
Right.
all this nonsense. And then before you know it, it's like, I'm going to vote for this, narcissistic sociopath with no care for the common good, who's allied with one of America's like most dire enemies. I mean, it's really kind of
It-
sad.
It's a pretty dark place we end up, and I'm going to ask you in a second about because you do finish the book with some kind of hopeful uh, sense of strategy, maybe would be the word I would use. But and I'll get to that in a minute. So before we get too bummed out, at the predicament, which is a dire one. I mean, it's a very dim kind of period in American history. I'm curious if the opposition, the Democrats, the libs, if they couldn't begin to penetrate that world that you've described on their own, or begin to build their own kind of a traveling show of competing coalitions, it is because I think last thing, and then I really do want to hear your answer, of course. It seems as though, and what I got, and this is kind of a bummer. I mean, I just kind of really kind of sort of am depressed at the momentum that these movements within the overall movement have achieved. And your book synthesizes it. Your book puts it together, and it just looks like such a tough mountain to climb to try to defeat it. And I'm curious if there's any sort of competing program that could get the kind of momentum ultimately that would perhaps overtake the sort of momentum I just described.
I think there are efforts now. I think there's a lot of recognition now of what folks are up against, and there are efforts to sort of among a lot of the existing organizations to start working in coalition. I mean, the strength of this movement is in its deep organizational infrastructure that has these different pieces, but then you have these networking organizations like the Council for National Policy or ZICLAG that really get members of the leadership on the same page, bring them together with funders. Like if you're in that world, if you have that kind of ideological, those aims, you're offered an immediate path for engagement and involvement. And the right and the left spend their money differently. The right has invested in organizations and individuals and leadership development and people, so that people, they find talented young people often who have the right ideological approach, and they invest in them so that those folks know they can secure their economic futures within the movement. And on the, I would say, moderate liberal left, you've got a much more fractious group of people who are not inclined to sort of follow authoritarian directives. So they're harder to organize. The joke is it's like herding cats. But more than that, they tend to invest their money in technocratic solutions, work in silos rather than working at cross purposes. So it's sort of, I've written my last 3 books to show how they've done it. That's why I've done it. We wouldn't want to emulate their most craven tactics, like inspiring political violence, spreading lies, demonizing the opposition, and doing that kind of thing. Like we wouldn't want to, a pro-democracy movement is implicitly upholding the values of democracy, which are equality and justice and rule of law. So we would have to do all of those things. We wouldn't want to do another January 6th thing or anything like that, which they did, launch an attack on the Capitol and try and have a coup against the US government. But here's where we can learn from what they do, that sort of thinking long-term, having a fairly big tent. Like, I actually think we should stop purity testing one another. We're not all going to agree on everything, but if we can agree on
That's
more,
like a favorite Democrat pastime. You may have trouble selling that.
well, I think a lot of people are really figuring out that, like, wow, we're not doing it right.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, they're so, the reason their movement is so successful is because much of it functions as a giant voter turnout machine. And they campaign all throughout the year rather than just at the election cycles. And they go after low propensity voters, and they really focus on turning out their base. I talk to a lot of folks, and everyone's like, how can I get my father-in-law to flip his vote? Well, you may not be able to. Still, have conversations and be a human being together, but you might not succeed in flipping his vote. So maybe you don't want to put all your energy there. Instead, go after, if you have a limited amount of energy, figure out where you're going to get the most, best chance of success. So persuading people that their vote matters, reaching out to the disenfranchised, holding people who do agree with you accountable to actually get out there on election day and vote all the way down the ballot.
Yeah, it's really true that voter turnout is really the challenge increasingly. And we talk a lot on the show about voter suppression and how that's sort of been taken to a high art. And gerrymandering is something that's been done by Democrats and Republicans. That's something else that's really undercut the people's voice. But the voter suppression techniques have become so aggressive. In my judgment, they really may have influenced the last election, but that's a conversation for another time. Um, Let me get to the hopeful parts of, and you've kind of just hinted at one, which is that you take the playbook, essentially, is what you're saying, that they have used effectively. They've sown the seeds of activism. They've sown the seeds of political administration at very local levels.
Mhm.
And you're right, they've seen it bloom. This is something that Jane Mayer talks about in the Dark Money book, just the fact that Koch brothers money is in high schools. It's not, it starts very early. And so let's stipulate to the fact that we do believe that we could learn something from that. What other areas of hope might there be to sort of begin to for the movement that's about democracy to actually achieve speed?
Well, first, we all need to get out of bed. I know after the election, a lot of people were like retreating, but this is not the time to do that. This is the time for moral courage. These attacks are going to have real consequences on real people, federal employees, people who use real services. We need to be able to, as people get hurt, we need to be able to say, look, those are the people who did this to you, and here are the people who are fighting for you. I also think we need to engage in our democracy in really meaningful ways. We have to remember we have elections in less than 2 years. And Donald Trump, the whole country didn't go MAGA. Donald Trump actually won by a statistically small percentage, if you look at other presidents and the percentages by which they win elections. And the challenge was that the enthusiasm for the vote was dampened on the Democratic side. So fewer people turned out to vote, and pulled the lever for the Democrats, and more people, Trump, I think, got more or less the same proportion. If you're looking at the percentage of people who are eligible to vote, as he got
The same as his last go round, you're saying? Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So we really need to get out our base. We need to go after low propensity voters, and we need to start right now, like now.
Yeah.
I think we should start, frankly, championing policies that actually involve real change. We should build uh, a kind of movement that actually messaging that broadens beyond the professional classes and help ordinary Americans understand the issues that are going to make a difference to them, and be really important to the majority of people. I don't need to get into the details here, but life is unaffordable for a lot of people. And when that's happening, they become resentful. And then those resentments can be more easily weaponized and turned against the very same people who actually want to help them. Another point I would say is, why aren't we going after these billionaires and making them pay their fair share of taxes? Why aren't we saying, you know, why aren't we saying you don't get to have all this, Bigfoot over all of our politics just because you have all this money? So, that's a
Well,
longer.
I would also say I think the Democrats, I mean, because we're two parties, and so whatever your vibe is, independent, whatever, I get it. But I mean, if you want to have a chance to get back into power, you're going to have to vote with the Democrats. Sadly, you've got one or two choices. But so I would say the Democrats need to make the Republicans own the fact that they're the party of billionaires, and that I think the more that stink can be made to stick to them, the more the resentful, grievance-filled crew that you discuss in your book who have come over. I don't know that you can get them over, but you can definitely get them maybe questioning and maybe not leaving the house to vote for a Republican. That's what I would hope. Bernie Sanders does it well. You know what I mean? I think he's one of the voices that cuts through. That's why I'll tell you, Katherine, quickly, people always say, we're looking for some young voices, some new young voices in the Democratic Party. I go, well, the best Democratic party member. He caucuses with the Democrats. I understand he's technically independent, but the best voice out there for the libs is Bernie Sanders, in my view. He cuts through the noise. You may not agree, but that kind of just bald face truth that he lays out, and in authentic ways, I think that's what the Democrats need more of.
Well, Democrats definitely need to start investing more in leadership development. That's for sure. I mean, the right does, that's another thing the right does really well. As recently at Charlie Kirk, who he is, he runs Turning Point
Sure.
USA. They do a lot of youth development. Leadership Institute reaches out and has a lot of youth development. So there are all these different ways in which they're finding young kids who sort of have the right approach and sort of shaping them and cultivating
I mean,
them.
Charlie Kirk was a young kid. I remember when Charlie Kirk was this little pisher that was coming up, and he was just making noise. And now he's a leader of a movement, or an important part of leading a movement.
He's very much so, and he's allying himself with ultra-conservative religious leaders in order to sort of work that angle. He's allying himself with some conspiracists, professional conspiracists, it seems like. Jack Posobiec, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who famously spread the Pizzagate conspiracy and things like that. So he's all in on this. But when you go to those events and you see all those young people, very enthusiastic with all of their MAGA hats and all of their sort of USH ears, you realize that this is something that Democrats could. I mean, now there are a lot of moderate, liberal, and progressive young people as well. I would say disproportionately more, but perhaps the right is a little bit better at getting folks engaged in politics in meaningful ways. So, for instance, when I go to a right-wing conference, the sort of exhibition hall is filled with booths. Oh, you want to get involved in public education? Here, do this here. Oh, you want to get involved in your town governance and bring biblical values? Here, do that here. Oh, this is another thing. We should definitely emphasize the importance of local activism. But no matter what your issue is within this right-wing sphere, no matter who you are, no matter how old you are, no matter how young you are, if you're disabled, you have a role to play. And then, this last summer, I went to the Democratic National Convention. I went to the exhibition hall. There were some really nice people selling some really nice food and people offering, tours of the city. And then, of course, there was Planned Parenthood and there were some other organizations that but you didn't get the sense that, oh, you want to get involved in the faith-based sphere, you want to get involved in somewhere in the secular sphere, you want to get involved in local politics, national, here's an organization for you. You didn't get the sense that people were there finding a path to engagement. So we need to, but the paths are out there. It's just, we've got to do a little research. It's like, I don't know, Marcus, when you buy a pair of shoes, do you do a little research? I do. I do. I mean, a lot of people ask me, what should I do? I'm like, well, do a little research, figure out what your strengths are, figure out what your, values, your core values are. And there are things we can do as individuals, of course, like vote and reach out to our circles and get them to vote. But there are things we can really only do best when we join together with others.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does start with you. That is to say, it starts, with each one of us, but then you have to build coalitions. And that, I think you lay that out so beautifully in the book. And the coalitions are, as I was saying at the beginning of this conversation, disparate, and you wouldn't necessarily put them together. You wouldn't put together a gazillionaire with somebody who is barely making it, but they both do end up on the same page running the same political play. And I love what you've detailed here, and I love that you've brought a coherence to it. I'll have a link to the book. Again, it's Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Katherine Stewart, you've really you've done a great job with this, and I congratulate you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on the show, and thanks to everybody watching.
Of course. Thank you.
The Mark Thompson Show.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell, you'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.